Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our event on export controls, uncovering Chinese military companies, hosted by AAEI and presented by Sayari. I'd like to thank AAEI for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Colby Potter. I'm a solutions manager and senior analyst with Sayari. And today I'm happy to spend some time talking about Chinese military companies and the risks that they can pose to commercial enterprises, especially within the context of export controls and related compliance. We'll be taking an introductory look at some of the data that we can use to identify these sorts of companies, as well as how various enterprises can determine whether exports may be ending up bound for such a company. And so, but as I go throughout, please feel free to throw any questions into the Q&A, and we'll try our best to address those at the end. I do, before we kick off, want to note this disclosure language from AAEI, and just note that it does not endorse, recommend, or promote any specific products, services, or offerings presented during this webinar. The views and opinions expressed by myself are my own and do not reflect the official position of AAEI. Attendees are encouraged to evaluate the information shared and make your own informed decisions. So, a brief note about Sayari, for those of you who may not be as familiar with us. Sayari is a commercial risk intelligence provider that seeks to give analysts and trade compliance practitioners global visibility into relationships between businesses and individuals. We instantly surface what we like to call hard to find connections between corporate entities and their shareholders, their subsidiaries, their customers, suppliers, buyers, and other related parties. We have the most comprehensive commercial risk data on the market, covering more than 250 jurisdictions worldwide. And from roughly 600 unique data sets, we have gathered nearly 6 billion original records. And from those records, we've built over 1 billion detailed entity profiles, companies and persons that maintain provenance back to their source documents. Our core focus is on official public records, so things like company formation, change notices, real property, and IP. But we also provide other high-value data layers, including trade data, sanctions and regulatory risks, and adverse media. But of course, more data, as we all know, isn't always going to be as useful. You need to be able to make sense of it and connect the dots. And that's where graph analytics come into play. And so we use our connected data to generate intuitive graph visualizations, illuminate cross-border networks, and expose hidden risk, allowing you to run more efficient and more effective compliance programs. So that's the background and the expertise in public records and where we're coming from, and some information about how to use them. But today, of course, I'm here to talk specifically about how we can use those corporate and trade records to identify connections to Chinese military companies. So before we dive in, I want to provide you all with a brief roadmap of what I would like to cover today. First, I think it's important to lay some necessary groundwork. I'll cover some general concepts about Beijing's policy of military civil fusion, or MCF, which is where the Chinese state invests in private industries and institutions to steer research and development to the benefit of the People's Liberation Army and broader technological acquisition or advancement. Following that, I'll provide a very top-level overview of some major restrictions on military end users, specifically those in China, because there's a lot of components to it, and it can be complicated for even the most seasoned practitioner. I know it certainly is for me. So these include government watch lists that offer the most direct way to begin to evaluate companies for status as a participant in military civil fusion. And so this will be an overview of those regulations that folks should be mindful of. And then finally, I'll spend the bulk of our time walking through several strategies for identifying these companies in China using publicly available data, with some examples using Sayari's Graph Commercial Risk Intelligence platform. That's going to include identifying some of these proscribed companies in another entity's ownership chain, or looking for indicators of MCF involvement based on a company's address, or utilizing Chinese government procurement data to boost our confidence in any assessment that a company may be at risk for being engaged in MCF or similar partnerships. And then by the end, I've hopefully left enough time for some Q&A, but any outstanding questions that I'm unable to get to, we'll certainly try to follow up offline as well. So to begin with, what do we mean when we say Chinese military companies? And here I actually want to take a step back from that question and examine a broader category that these types of companies can and often are considered to be a part of. And that broader category is of military end users, or MEUs. The U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security within the Department of Commerce, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Defense have all implemented several export control or related regulations designed to restrict the sale, export, or transfer of certain U.S. origin goods and technologies to certain foreign entities for military end use. So these regulations primarily target countries like Venezuela, Russia, and important for our topic today, China, all with an aim of preventing U.S. technology and products from being used to supply military capabilities for what we consider to be adversarial nations. And so that can mean items that, for example, enable Moscow to conduct its war in Ukraine. But for today, we're going to focus on Chinese military companies or those private Chinese companies that operate on behalf of or to the benefit of the Chinese military. And the way this typically occurs is under what's called China's military civil fusion strategy. So the military civil fusion strategy, or MCF, as I'll refer to it throughout, represents an overarching policy that encourages private companies to cooperate with China's military in order to accelerate technological innovation, economic development, and military modernization. In very simple terms, promising companies that Beijing identifies receive more resources, more financing, more assistance for research and development, while the military benefits from potential breakthroughs. Dual-use technologies are the primary focus of this strategy, so the coordination among China's military, Chinese state-owned enterprises, Chinese research institutes, and private companies in China largely is focused on fields like telecommunications, AI, aerospace, biotechnology, just to name a few. The strategy is intentionally broad. In theory, any Chinese company that produces dual-use technologies could fall under MCF, regardless of whatever sector that it operates in, regardless of its size or its corporate structure. And one important distinction to make is critical, and that is that the role of legal ownership and control in MCF does not have to, and oftentimes doesn't, align neatly with traditional frameworks for understanding corporate risk. And by that, I mean most of these companies are privately owned. Many are heavily integrated into the global economy, and few are ever legally owned or controlled by the PLA or even the Chinese state. Legally, these are private companies. Also worth mentioning are state-backed investment vehicles used to fund dual-use technologies and encourage the MCF strategy. These include major funds like the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, which was set up by China's Ministry of Finance in order to invest primarily in China's semiconductor industry, though it certainly has investments in other sectors as well. And it directly and indirectly owns shares in thousands of companies in China, but also abroad. Many of these companies in China have been identified as Chinese military companies by the US government. The Trump and Biden administrations designated some of this fund's shareholders as military companies as well. So these include entities like those you see here, the China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, CETC, and the China Mobile Communications Group, both involved in dual-use technology and both involved in dual-use technology in support of Chinese military operations. So I will touch upon those funds a bit more in just a moment. And so this presents the challenge for officials and companies alike working to comply or enforce regulations. MCF widens the stage rather for China's military industrial complex and the number of civilian companies that it can and does collaborate with. And as the examples that we'll cover show, we can't simply go looking for Chinese military or SOEs among a company's shareholders in order to confirm whether that company was involved in MCF. So the question becomes, what then can we really do? Again, the Departments of Commerce, Treasury, and Defense have identified some of these entities and included them on various watch lists, but these are deliberately non-exhaustive. And so in a moment, we'll go over some ways in which we can use public data primarily to begin to close some of those remaining gaps. Before we do that, though, I think it's helpful to review some of the ways that the US government in particular has approached this issue up to this point. So in recent years, the US government has established several watch lists in order to help serve as a reliable reference and enforcement mechanism for American companies and regulators. So these are part of an effort to prevent enterprises from inadvertently supporting the Chinese military by doing business with Chinese companies that ostensibly seem free from any government links, but nonetheless are military in-use companies or those participating in MCF and seeking to import sensitive US technologies or know-how. And so when it comes to these watch lists, there are three broader categories that I think are worth keeping in mind, and they generally align with the three US government agencies that I just mentioned. So Commerce, Defense, and Treasury. So within the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, established and maintains the military end user list. In 2020, BIS expanded guidance to define an MEU in China as any Chinese entity, regardless of ownership, that contributes to the operation, maintenance, or production of military items. Also in 2020, the Department of Defense released the names of several dozen Chinese companies that it designated as, quote, communist Chinese military companies that were operating directly or indirectly in the US per Section 1237 of the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, of 1999. This Section 1237 list was then superseded in 2021 by a new list of, quote, Chinese military companies per the updated NDAA in 2021. And this version is the version of the list whose statutory requirement remains in effect today and was most recently updated earlier this year. Then finally, we have the non-SDN Chinese Military Industrial Complex Companies List, or NSCMIC. It's a bit of a mouthful, as is its acronym, but that is maintained by the Treasury Department and its Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. So this was initiated in late 2020 when then President Trump issued Executive Order 13959, which was then amended and expanded by President Biden under a new EO in June 2021. And the NSCMIC list technically focuses on restricting US persons from purchasing or selling publicly traded securities of listed companies. However, as the name clearly states, the list identifies those Chinese companies that meet the criteria or exhibit certain characteristics of MEUs through their research and development activities and associations with the Chinese military industrial complex. So the primary goal with this regulation is to curtail US investment in companies that support China's military, defense, or intelligence activities. And it's also worth mentioning several other watch lists here that I haven't included on this slide, but things like the BIS entity list, its unverified list, and OFAC's SDN list. Those other watch lists do not explicitly target Chinese military companies like the ones listed here do, but they do include other high-risk Chinese companies that could fit the criteria. BIS specifically has added a number of Chinese companies to the entity list because of their support for things like for military applications, and we assess we are likely to see that practice continue. And while it's not necessarily a list of Chinese military companies, I do also want to call out BIS's expanded licensing requirements on things like semiconductors and advanced computing chips. These were requirements that were announced in October 2022 and then expanded last year. And with these requirements, BIS explicitly called out advanced computing, integrated circuits, supercomputers, semiconductor manufacturing equipment as potentially enabling military modernization, including the development of things like weapons of mass destruction and human rights abuses in China. So those regulations, certainly while having a larger geopolitical impact and remit, can still be considered part of the US government's strategy to, in effect, cut off inadvertent US support to Chinese military companies. So I've introduced the concept of China's military civil fusion strategy. We've touched on how big these challenges can be. We've touched on what the relevant watch lists are currently. So now we can hop into how we might begin to address the issue. How are we supposed to find these companies? It can be difficult, but there are several strategies we can use to begin tackling the problem. And so these strategies include using the watch lists we've just gone over, looking into ownership relationships, looking into investments from funds like those I mentioned earlier, looking at a company's location in China, and looking at contracting relationships that the company might have with the government. So we'll go through each one in turn. So to begin with, Strategy one, verify that the company in question is not on an export control list. If you are trying to identify potential Chinese military companies, the most obvious and important place to start is with those watch lists themselves. It's straightforward enough to be sure, but it's also worth considering this approach a bit further because sometimes it can be a little tricky to utilize that information on these lists in an effective manner. So here are some excerpts from the three lists that I mentioned earlier, the NSCMIC, the BIS MEU list, and the 1260H lists. And so as you can see here, we get varying levels of detail as far as company identifying information goes. To start with, everything is in English, which can be helpful, but we aren't given the legal Chinese names of companies, and that complicates matters. And that's because in mainland China, company names in Chinese are highly standardized and therefore unique, but their English trade names can vary and aren't always unique. And sometimes the name that they're known by in the West does not even appear in Chinese public records. A Chinese company can transact outside China using an English translation of its name, a pinyin phonetic transcription of its name, or an official English trade name that has no relationship to its Chinese name. And sometimes it'll use all three of those interchangeably, making it very difficult to track it across different data sources. And so the best way to get around the challenges of company names is to look at other info like addresses or ID numbers. But as you can hopefully see here, that information isn't always provided consistently across these lists. The NSCMIC list, for example, tends to provide very useful identifiers, such as the Uniform Social Credit Code, or USCC. And that's terrific because the USCC, again, Uniform Social Credit Code, those numbers are unique. In fact, the USCC is the primary unique identifier issued to all Chinese companies, but the other lists on the screen may not provide that. And all of that is to say that these lists are going to be the obvious place to start if you're trying to identify Chinese military companies, but you may need to do a little legwork, I think, in order to make those lists fully usable or utilize them to their utmost potential. So we'll take a look at one company in particular. It's called Beijing Ander Tech, which is on the military end user list, the MEU list. And on the right, you can see what information we're getting from what's contained on that list. And you can see that we're really only getting an English name and an address from BIS. If this is all the information you get from the lists, then this on the next slide is what you would get if you, or in this case, we were to enrich those data points from the watch list with detailed identifying information available in separate Chinese public records. With this much added detail, you're now able to determine with higher confidence whether your investigation target has been designated for Chinese military affiliation or not. So just to underscore here, if you're just working straight from a list, you may only have that English trade name and an English language address of a company to match against, versus all of this information on the right that you could have if it were enriched with publicly available corporate records. Here is a further breakdown as well, comparing what information we can get from the lists and what information we can get when we complement that with public records as well. And you'll note that we're getting not only critical information like shareholding, but also owner and control relationships when we bring those public records to bear. So we have those US watch lists, and we can use public data to build out more robust profiles of those companies to aid our investigations. But those watch lists do not comprehensively cover every high-risk Chinese company when we're concerned with this context. We've seen this play out as new companies are routinely added to the lists, and the regulators themselves have verified it. If a military end user is in any way or any entity that develops, produces, maintains, or uses military items, how then do we move beyond the explicitly named companies on these watch lists to identify those that are perhaps less known, but no less risky? And so the next four strategies, with the next four strategies, I hope to use examples from Sayari Graph, which again is our platform for investigating, conducting due diligence into companies, individuals, and their related networks. Everything I'm about to show is technically feasible, provided you have access to the necessary databases or records, But a technical solution like Sayari Graph does make all of this much easier, much quicker, and much simpler to convey. And so we'll start by looking at corporate relationships. If a company you are exporting technology to is owned or controlled by another company that appears on one of these US watch lists, then that company likely poses a higher risk of Chinese military affiliation too. So I'm going to show you how to identify connections like that using Chinese public records. And Sayari Graph, to take advantage of the graph visualizations there, will also allow us to expand those networks further. So bear with me for one moment, please, as I switch over to Graph. And so I'm going to show you an example of why looking at corporate ownership matters for identifying companies participating in MCF. And we'll begin here with a company called Shenzhen Jinbear. Also, when we translate it, it may come up as Jinbel, but Shenzhen Jinbear Communication Technology Co. Limited. It itself is not on any kind of list, none of the ones I just mentioned. And in fact, none of its direct owners or control parties are on any kind of list. So far, we don't really have any obvious red flags for military affiliation. Now, Graph includes a translate option if, like me, you don't speak Chinese. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that. And anything in yellow has been translated. Translation has been overlaid onto the underlying records in native language. So the next question, if this entity is not on a watch list, the next question becomes, who ultimately owns this company? And if we work our way up that ownership chain, might we find a high-risk company that is on a US watch list? So Shenzhen Jinbear has 3 shareholders. We could begin there. Next, we would need to identify those shareholders and their shareholders, and so on through some unknown number of layers until we hit the ultimate beneficial owner, the UBO. We can do that manually, looking at the individual public records for each of these companies in turn and following them down their respective rabbit holes, just like we're doing here, looking at Shenzhen Jinbear's record. But that is, unsurprisingly, pretty tedious and heavily manual. It's especially tedious in China, where these ownership structures can get very complicated very quickly. So one of the benefits of housing this data in a graph database, though, is that we can use automation to shortcut that process and have the system just tell us straight out who ultimately owns this company and whether there are any ties to an export controls watch list there. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to take this shortcut. And so what I'll do here is I will task the system to find any entity in Shenzhen Jinbear's upstream ownership chain that is flagged on some export control list and go ahead and hit submit. And when we do that, what we're seeing here is a list of any companies that have a direct or indirect stake in Shenzhen Jinbear Communication Technology, and that also show up on a US export control list. And so we can look at both of these relationship chains and add it to a graph canvas to make things a bit clearer. And when we do, here we have the direct ownership chain between Shenzhen Jinbear Communication Technology and the watch listed aviation industry of China, aka AVIC, at the top. AVIC shows up on a number of watch lists, including the NSCMIC list and the 1260H list. Neither the NSCMIC nor the 1260H list have strict export controls, but as we've highlighted before, entities on both lists have been flagged as high risk by BIS, and there are quite a few AVIC subsidiaries and other affiliated entities within its network that are on the entity list and the MEU list. So it's certainly a relevant insight from all of those angles to identify that our target here is ultimately owned by this entity. And I'd just like to underscore once again that our original company, Shenzhen Jinbear, does not appear on any US watch lists. Neither does the direct shareholder, the Shenzhen MyWay Cable TV Equipment Company, but the ultimate parent does. And as a result, we should be concerned about the risk of military affiliation further down this corporate ownership network. And I will point out too that this is not the whole network. This is just one path of interest. Shenzhen MyWay Cable TV, for example, has 5 subsidiaries. AVIC itself has well over 100 direct subsidiaries and 27 branches, probably more so now, I think, most of which would have subsidiaries of their own if we kept expanding these linkages. So you can begin to kind of get a sense for the scale of the potential risk here. And now looking back at our original target entity, you all may be wondering, for example, what this little orange indicator next to the name is. If any of you are current or previous graph users, this should be really familiar. This is what we call a risk factor, and risk factors are indicators of specific risk types that allow users to quickly identify and prioritize critical issues more easily. And so currently within Graph, we have about 100, over 100 different risk factors broken down into multiple categories, such as forced labor, export controls, political exposure, among others. And those can be assigned different tiers of severity or criticality based on a user's interests and their organization's risk profile, risk appetite, or risk framework. And so these risk factors, what they do is they will include more obvious risks, such as those entities that appear on a particular sanctions list or export control list. So think of companies like AVIC. But we're also flagging companies that are risky because of their relationships, whether they are corporate relationships like ownership or control, or trade relationships, or any other corporate relationship, and flag it that way. And so in this case, if I hover over this, we've tagged our original target entity with a risk factor based on the fact that it is owned directly or indirectly by a company, AVIC in this case, that is present on a number of watch lists. And I don't even have to manually build out the network in a graph canvas like we just saw in order to identify the specific ownership path behind this risk factor. Graph does it for us here and flags it there. We can also navigate to its risk factor section and find those entities that are perhaps on a sanctions list or on an export control list. And here we see AVIC yet again. So the takeaway from this analysis, to bring this back full circle, is that it's really important to look at company ownership and control when you're determining the risk of potential Chinese military companies. For a lot of these companies, corporate relationships are the only place in public records where you would even find red flag indicators like this. So far, we've been leveraging lists of known Chinese military companies as designated by the US government. But how can we move even further beyond that? What about the military companies that aren't on a list and don't have any direct or indirect connections to something on a list like AVIC? And this is the third strategy. First was watch lists. The second was looking at corporate ownership relationships. Third is looking at investment from an MCF, again, military civil fusion, an MCF fund. And the Chinese government at both national and local levels uses a variety of policy tools in order to incentivize the private sector to research and manufacture dual-use technologies. And if we understand these policy tools, then we can learn how to trace them and the companies taking advantage of them through public records. So the first tool we'll talk about is government-guided investment funds. I said earlier that companies participating in the MCF strategy are not directly owned by the military, and that's true, and are typically not majority owned by the state. And here's where that distinction comes into play, and in a very important way. Chinese government entities at both the national and local levels have created investment funds directed at military civil fusion innovation. And these funds also include capital from private companies. China's use of MCF funds and similar investment vehicles is part of its broader strategy to, again, accelerate the modernization of its military. And as we discussed before, the intent is to resource promising companies and expedite R&D for them. MCF funds theoretically provide more nimble financing and allow more capital to directly finance MCF related businesses. And so identifying one of these funds and a company's ownership is incredibly indicative because their investments are explicitly directed toward military civil fusion and the production of dual use goods. Companies with investments from these funds are at high risk of being military companies, but luckily, given China's regulations on reporting ownership, government-guided investment funds are actually relatively easy to find in public records. So I'm going to hop into a new entity to show an example of that. This one is called Shanghai Chujiang Technology and Trade Development Co. Limited. And now, once again, we need to look at its ownership, although this time we're looking for any military civil fusion investment funds instead of a watch listed company. So I can pull up its shareholder, and we see this company here. We see that Shanghai Chujiang Technology and Trade Development Company's only shareholder is a company called Anhui Chujiang Technology New Materials Co. Limited. Doesn't have that phrase or any other indication that it might be an MCF fund. So at this point, we really haven't identified any red flags for either of these companies being potential Chinese military companies. But we can begin to take a look behind the immediate shareholder to identify any military affiliation risk having to do with MCF investment funds. So in similar fashion, I'm going to task the system to find any beneficial owner, but contrary to last time, what I am going to do is type in military civil fusion. I'm going to use our translate option here to translate that phrase into Chinese. And so what I'm doing is searching the term in Chinese of military civil fusion and the names of any entity in Shanghai Chujiang Technology's ownership chain to catch any explicitly named MCF funds. And fortunately for us, Chinese government regulations and registries mandate a fairly standard approach to corporate naming so that many MCF companies include the Chinese phrase that I just translated to in their actual name. One more tricky thing about these investment vehicles, though, is that the point isn't always to own, control, or direct the company. So oftentimes they're not going to be the majority owner of the company in question. Often the shareholding stake will be very minor. So even if the shareholding percentage from a government-guided investment fund is small, you still can't ignore it. And that may seem counterintuitive to any of you if you've been operating with the traditional approach to UBO, which largely aligns with, say, OFAC's 50% rule in the context of sanctions. 50% and above does not apply here. And so what I'm going to do is, instead of specifying bring back any companies with 10% minimum share percentage or higher, I'm going to scale this actually down to 0 because we can't ignore those much smaller percentages. And so when I do that, we end up with 2 military civil fusion investment/development funds in this company's ownership chain. And again, just like before, we can pivot this over into a graph chart. Close that for a second. And see that one of these companies, the National MCF Investment Fund, has an almost 5% stake in Shanghai Chujiang Technology's direct owner, that Anhui company we saw earlier. When we're dealing with Chinese government-guided investment funds in particular, again, we can't infer relevance from ownership percentage. Larger percentage does not necessarily mean larger influence or larger control. Again, we're only looking at 5% approximately of ownership here, but it's a very significant 5%. We can look more closely at the National Military Civil Integration Industry Investment Fund as another example. So here is another example of one of those funds. Again, it has the verbiage in the name, and we can take a look at its ownership stakes. So here I've gone into all the companies that it is a shareholder of, and we can see that it has ownership stakes in over 100 companies. However, if we were to dive into any of these relationships further, we would see that the majority of these are very minor stakes between, I don't know, around a single percentage to up to about 41%. And so these funds' express purpose is to direct capital toward industries that the Chinese government has deemed strategically important. They're not necessarily interested in financial control over their target investments. So even if the shareholding percentage from an MCF fund is small, you can't ignore it. It is still significant to the analysis of military companies. And to be sure, this MCF fund or any fund with MCF or related phrase in the name, they are not going to be the only investment vehicles that the Chinese government uses to direct investment toward dual-use technology. So one example of a well-known fund that lacks MCF in its name, but is still central to China's military modernization efforts, is the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, which I mentioned earlier. So this fund was established in 2014 in support of China's growing semiconductor industry. With new US controls on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing items being exported to China, the fund now plays an even more critical role in China's development of its advanced semiconductor industry. So notable downstream holdings of this fund have included things like Beijing's BD Star Navigation Co. Limited, which specializes in navigation and positioning services in China, and was added to the entity list for its support to China's high altitude balloon program. Also includes companies like Syntec Networks Suzhou Co. Limited, which was listed in 2023. Syntec designs chips for 5G network equipment in support of China's quantum computing industry and has received funding from overseas investors. So there are plenty of other companies that the National Integrated Circuit Industry Fund here has a stake in, though they have not yet been listed. But as the examples I just mentioned indicate, these other entities that have not been listed are likely at risk for that in the future. So that wraps up that third strategy for looking for MCF investment. The fourth strategy has to do with location. Specifically, does the company list an address at a military civil fusion integration zone? So in addition to investment funds, I want to talk about another Chinese government investment tool, and that is called Military Civil Fusion Innovation Zones, MCF zones. Provincial and municipal level governments in China are incentivized to broadcast or promote their support for the military through their participation in military civil fusion. And one way that they have traditionally done this is through innovation zones. And these are office park-like spaces that provide office space and capital for companies focused on certain dual-use technologies. So if a company is based out of one of these zones now, or was at some point in the past, it's likely that the Chinese government has their eyes on that company's products and research and technology, all for adaptation to military uses. Chinese addresses can be fairly standardized as far as addresses go. So when a company is located in something like an office park, the name of that park is oftentimes included in the registered address disclosed in Chinese company registers. So that makes it relatively easy when a company is based out of an MCF innovation zone to identify one of those companies when it's located in an MCF innovation zone through those public records. So by way of example, I'm going to hop into another company's profile. Here we have a company called Hunan Keqiang Information Technology Co. Limited. And if we take a look at the address, we already have that translate button on. So we can see here under the address field that this company reports an address at a military civilian integration science and technology innovation industrial park. Mouthful, but it's a translation. And so without this knowledge, we might not know that this company has any connection to military civil fusion. Its name doesn't seem to immediately reveal any military connections. If we were to check its beneficial ownership network, we would see that none of its shareholders are showing up on watch lists and none of them are MCF investment funds. Going down the list of our strategies, none of those previous boxes are checked. So this is why addresses can then be key to assessing military end user risk in Chinese companies. And it's also why we at Sayari now flag any company that lists an address in an MCF zone with potential military end user risk. And again, hovering over the risk indicator that we have here, we see that Hunan Keqiang is flagged for being an MCF entity. And again, that's based off of semantic analysis, automated semantic analysis that identifies this address as being located in one of those MCF innovation zones. So addresses are that fourth strategy. The fifth strategy involves procurement. Does the company have a record of government procurement relationships? Does it partner with the government in that way? And so we can take a look using Chinese government procurement data to determine if there's a possible MCF relevant relationship between the company and the Chinese state. This won't always definitively determine MCF involvement, but it's another approach that can elevate the confidence that we might have in assessing possible MCF and or MEU risk. And so there are a couple of terrific sources for this approach. The first is called the Central Government Procurement Center Enterprise. This was established in 2003. It serves as a central database for profiles of companies that have been authorized to contract with the with the Chinese government, excuse me. Among other things, it includes industry and business purpose information, which is great at allowing us to identify those that might be engaged in fields with dual use or military applications. The other key data source that I'd like to spotlight is the Chinese Ministry of Finance's government procurement announcements. Both of these sources are contained within the Sayari Graph platform, but the government procurement announcements, Chinese law requires certain, quote, procurement agencies to announce procurement information in accordance with the Chinese Ministry of Finance and its domestic regulations. So this provides details about various procurement agreements, including company information of entities that are contracting with the Chinese government in some capacity. And so using these, we can actually identify risk-relevant contracts with certain Chinese government bodies. And so we'll stay with Hunan Keqiang information technology here for a moment. But because we are collecting this information, we can actually bring up its contracting information and see contracts listed with municipal public security bureaus in China. Now, BIS defines a military end user as, quote, the national armed services, as well as the National Guard and National Police, government intelligence or reconnaissance organizations, or any person or entity whose actions or functions are intended to support military end users, which is fairly broad and which is why we also flag within Sayari Graph entities that are authorized to contract with their respective government when it's a jurisdiction like China, Russia, or Venezuela. And we will flag such entities with a risk factor in order to flag potential military end use concerns in that respect. So this top level risk factor here called government contractors in a BIS MEU country. And we also will reference the original source providing us that insight. And even when that military end use isn't as clear, we can still use this contract information to uncover companies that are still engaged in highly sensitive or dual use industries. So one more example is going to be ComNav Technology. ComNav, which is also known as Shanghai Sinan Satellite Navigation Technology Co. Limited, is, as the name might indicate, a satellite company, and it specializes in implementing China's BeiDou navigation satellite system, which is China's rival to the US Global Positioning System, or GPS. The BeiDou system has been spotlighted by Chinese officials in particular as a model for MCF, given the role of companies like ComNav here and the obvious applications that those technological innovations have for military-related use. And using, again, Chinese procurement data, we can see that ComNav is heavily involved in China's Belt Road Initiative. Again, here, these are dual-use technologies, so while many of these contracts are undeniably civilian or peaceful in their application, the technology involved, the system's role in MCF, and ComNav's government contracts as part of the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, raise the potential risk that it or companies like it may be involved in MCF. So let me hop back into the slides here. And revisit the 5 strategies that I wanted to share with you all today. So first, make sure you have enough information to even verify if a company is on a list or not. Second, check the company's corporate network for connections to that list. Is this customer or reseller owned by a named military end user? Third, track movement of funds. Is this company funded by an MCF investment fund? Fourth, check the attributes of the company. Is it located in an MCF zone? And fifth, does it contract with elements of the Chinese state that might qualify it as a potential military end user? US regulators have made it clear that Chinese military companies pose a threat to national and economic security, but the analysts tasked with both enforcing and complying with these regulations really do face a considerable challenge. How can you identify the companies, but also how can you identify them when they are by definition civilian companies without obvious ties to the Chinese military or state more broadly? And it is difficult, but hopefully I've shown how we can leverage access to some highly detailed and rich Chinese public records and an understanding of how military civil fusion operates to begin to get ahead of the problem as best as we can. All of the techniques that I've talked about today are practical, easy to implement without being on the ground in China, or as you saw, without being able to speak Chinese. And they they can successfully identify high-risk Chinese companies. Many of my colleagues back at Sayari have written incredibly informative pieces that go into more depth on these sorts of corporate networks. So I encourage folks to check out our website, search those out. Also kind of keep an ear out over the next couple of weeks because we'll have some new product offerings that offer some creative ways to target this and other risk. I will stop there and see if there are any questions I can answer in our remaining time. Thank you all for your time and attention today.